The soft hum of hospital machines filled the room, a steady reminder of the fragility of life. Sarah sat beside the bed, her hands gripping the cold armrest, her fingers numb with exhaustion. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung thick in the air, mingling with the heavy silence that seemed to swallow every word, every thought. Her mother lay motionless, the once vibrant woman reduced to a frail figure tangled in tubes and wires. Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, grief, fear, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Just a week ago, her mother had been the picture of health, full of energy, laughter, and love. Now her life hung by a thread. The doctors had said there was nothing more they could do. There were no more treatments to try, no more hope to offer. Her mother, her guiding light, was slipping away, and there was nothing Sarah could do but watch. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Her younger brother, James, entered the room, his face pale, eyes red from lack of sleep. He had been trying to hold it together, but Sarah could see the cracks in his composure. He was just as lost as she was. "I prayed this morning, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice breaking as he wiped his eyes. "I prayed for a miracle, but nothing. It feels like God isn't listening." Sarah's heart tightened at his words. She hadn't said it out loud, but she too had been wrestling with the same thought. Was God silent? Had he abandoned them in their darkest hour? For days, she had tried to hold on to her faith, repeating the comforting Bible verses she had learned since childhood. But in the face of her mother's suffering, those words felt hollow, like an old song that had lost its meaning. God is good. God is faithful. But where was he now? Wasn't he supposed to heal the sick, restore the brokenhearted, and bring comfort to the suffering? As the evening light faded outside, casting long shadows across the hospital room, Sarah felt the weight of those questions pressing down on her soul. How could she continue to believe in God's goodness when everything around her seemed to be falling apart? How could she reconcile the pain of her mother's illness with the image of a loving, all-powerful God? B. Brief reflection. Suffering has a way of turning life upside down. It tests everything we think we know about the world, and it challenges our understanding of faith. In times of deep pain, when our hearts are broken and our bodies weary, it is not uncommon for us to question God's goodness. We ask ourselves, why bad things happen to good people, why innocent children suffer, and why prayers seem to go unanswered. We wonder if God truly sees our pain, if he truly cares about our suffering, or if he is even present in our darkest moments. Sarah was no stranger to suffering. She had lost her father years ago to cancer, and yet she had somehow made it through. That loss had shaken her, but she had clung to the hope that one day she would see him again in heaven. But this was different. Watching her mother, the one who had nurtured and cared for her all her life, slipping away slowly and painfully, felt like a cruel betrayal. Where was God in this? The questions came fast and fierce, each one more urgent than the last. Why now? Why her? Why my family? There were no answers, at least none that made sense. In those moments, the idea of a good and loving God seemed distant, perhaps even unreachable. How could anyone reconcile the reality of suffering with the belief in a God who is both good and all-powerful? As Sarah looked at her brother, the same question echoed in her mind. Can we still believe in God's goodness in the midst of suffering? It was a question that went beyond her own pain. It was a question that haunted her heart and mind every time she saw the pain in her brother's eyes, every time she heard the desperate cries of those who had lost loved ones, every time she saw the world broken by war, illness, and injustice. It was a question that seemed impossible to answer when you were staring at the very thing that threatened to crush your soul. Yet Sarah knew that there was something more at stake than simply finding answers. If God's goodness was real, then it had to be real even in the hardest, most painful moments of life. If God was truly good, then that goodness had to transcend circumstances, not be dependent on the fleeting moments of joy or comfort we experience in this world. But how? How could she trust in that goodness when her world was crumbling around her? The purpose of this story is to explore the tension between faith and suffering, to wrestle with the question of God's goodness in the midst of pain. It is easy to trust in God when life is good, when things are going as planned, when our loved ones are healthy, when the future feels secure. But what happens when the rug is pulled out from under us? What happens when our world is turned upside down and nothing makes sense? Can we still see God's goodness when the pain seems unbearable? Can we still trust that He is with us when everything around us feels like it's falling apart? Can we find hope in the midst of despair, light in the darkness, peace in the chaos? Through Sarah's journey, we will see how faith doesn't always offer easy answers, but it can provide something even more powerful: the assurance that we are not alone in our suffering, that God's goodness is not contingent on our circumstances, and that His presence can be felt even in our deepest pain. This story will not shy away from the rawness of suffering, but it will also point to the quiet yet undeniable ways in which God's goodness is revealed, even in the darkest of times. In the end, the question of God's goodness may never have a simple or tidy answer, but it is through the struggle, the questioning, and the seeking that we often discover a deeper understanding of who God is and what it means to trust in His love. The days following her mother's diagnosis had been a blur, a haze of endless doctor's visits, hospital corridors, and sterile rooms. It was as though her world had been fractured, and she was trying, desperately, to piece together a reality that made sense. But nothing made sense. Not anymore. Sarah had always been the strong one, the dependable daughter who could handle any storm. But now, as she sat in the cold waiting room, her eyes fixed on the flickering fluorescent lights above her, she felt as if she was drowning in a sea of sorrow. The pain was not just physical, though the sight of her mother, once so full of life and now so frail, was excruciating. It was the weight of a deep, gnawing grief that stretched through her body, coiling around her chest until it became hard to breathe. Every thought seemed to be soaked in sorrow. She couldn't remember the last time she had laughed, or when she had felt the lightness of a day free from worry. Even the most mundane activities, driving to the grocery store, walking through the front door of her house, felt like monumental tasks. Every part of her life was being overshadowed by the unrelenting pain of watching her mother wither away, helplessly, before her eyes. The emptiness was all-consuming. It felt as though the very essence of her existence had been drained, and what was left was a hollow shell. Every morning she awoke with the same pit in her stomach, the gnawing realization that nothing was the same, that the world had shifted, and she couldn't find solid ground. She had tried to continue on as though everything was normal. She went through the motions, spoke to friends, made the necessary phone calls, but inside she was falling apart. She had loved her mother with a depth that words could scarcely capture. Her mother had been her rock, the one person she could always rely on, the one who understood her without words. Now, she was slipping away. The grief was so deep that it was almost physical, as though something inside her was breaking with each passing day. And in the silence of the hospital room she was overwhelmed by a profound loneliness, a solitude that couldn't be filled by anyone or anything. There was a profound isolation in suffering, a sense that no one could truly understand the depth of what she was going through. She wanted to scream, to demand an answer, but the silence seemed to suffocate her words. Her body felt as though it were constantly aching, as though the weight of her emotional pain had seeped into her bones. The sorrow was so intense that it seemed to blur the edges of everything else in her life. And yet, it wasn't just physical exhaustion that drained her. It was the crushing hopelessness that seemed to settle in her heart, a hopelessness that seemed to whisper, "This is your reality now. There is no escape. In moments like this, doubt crept in like a shadow. She had been raised to believe in God's goodness. She had been taught to trust in His love, to believe that He was with her through every trial, every hardship. But now, as she sat beside her mother's hospital bed, watching her struggle to take each shallow breath, those truths seemed to evaporate, replaced by an aching question. Where is God? The anger bubbled up within her, raw and unfamiliar. She had always trusted in God's plan, believed that He was good, that He worked all things for good. But how could this be good? How could it be part of His plan? If God was good, why was He allowing her mother to suffer? Why was He allowing her to suffer? She had whispered quiet prayers every night, but each one felt like an echo, bouncing off the cold walls of the hospital room. Please, God, please, heal her, save her. But nothing. No miraculous healing, no divine intervention. Just the steady, cruel march of time, bringing her mother closer to the brink of death. The confusion inside her heart swirled. Was this punishment? Had she done something wrong? No, she thought. She had been faithful, she had trusted God, had prayed for her mother's healing. Yet here she was, facing the painful reality that the God she had placed all her hope in seemed to have turned a deaf ear to her cries. And that was the worst part, the feeling of abandonment. She found herself sitting alone in the quiet of the hospital room, tears streaming down her face, asking, "Where are you, God? How could you let this happen?" She had heard the stories of faith and miraculous healings, stories of God stepping in when all seemed lost. And yet, none of those stories were hers. No angel had appeared to deliver her from this pain, no sudden divine answer. Only the silence of God. In those moments, she wanted to shake her fist at the heavens and demand an explanation. It was hard to keep believing in the God she had known for so long when all the evidence before her pointed to something else. A world that was cruel and indifferent. A God who either couldn't or wouldn't intervene. As Sarah walked out of the hospital later that evening, the contrast between her inner turmoil and the world outside felt stark and unbearable. The streets were still bustling with life. People were laughing, talking, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. Cars zipped by, their drivers lost in their own worlds. She couldn't help but feel a twinge of anger at how life seemed to be moving forward so easily for everyone else, while hers was standing still in agony. It was a strange, suffocating loneliness. The isolation of suffering in a world that seemed unaffected by it. Everywhere she turned, people were going about their lives, unaware of the grief that had consumed her. It was as though she had entered a parallel world where joy still existed, where the future still held promise, and where people still had the luxury of not worrying about what tomorrow might bring. She passed a young couple laughing outside a cafe, a child playing with a balloon, and felt a stab of bitterness in her heart. Why couldn't I be like them? She wondered. Why couldn't I be free from this pain? It wasn't just the world around her that seemed oblivious to her suffering. There was a disconnect even within her closest relationships. Her friends and family tried to comfort her, but their words fell flat. "It's going to be okay," they said. "You have to keep your faith." But those words seemed distant, disconnected from the raw reality of her pain. They didn't understand what it felt like to watch someone you loved fade away. They couldn't comprehend the depth of the confusion, the loss of hope, the aching emptiness that consumed her. In her heart, it felt as though everyone was going on with their lives while she was being left behind. Each conversation, each attempt at comfort, only deepened her sense of isolation. The world around her continued, but she was stuck in a place where nothing seemed to matter anymore. Her grief had become her constant companion, and she could no longer bridge the gap between herself and the rest of the world. She was trapped, both physically in the sterile hospital room and emotionally in the isolation of her suffering. This was the most painful part, the feeling that in her agony, she was utterly alone. Everyone else had their lives to return to, their moments of joy to chase, but she was anchored to a life of grief and unanswered prayers. It was as if suffering had isolated her in a way she hadn't anticipated, because even though others were physically present, it was impossible to explain the depth of her heartache. And so, Sarah continued to wrestle with her pain. The world around her remained unaware, while she sought to navigate a road of suffering where faith and doubt collided with every step she took. The hospital had become Sarah's second home, and she could feel its coldness seeping into her soul, each sterile hallway adding weight to her already burdened heart. The days had blurred together, an endless cycle of medical updates, quiet prayers, and brief moments spent in her mother's room. But it wasn't the routine that kept her going. It was the small, unexpected moments that began to remind her that she wasn't alone. It started on a Wednesday evening when Sarah, drained from another long day, stepped outside for a quick break. The hospital's parking lot was nearly empty as most visitors had gone home, leaving the grounds quiet except for the hum of distant traffic. She sat on a bench near the entrance, hoping for a few moments of peace, but as she sat there, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Hannah, an old friend from college whom Sarah hadn't seen in months. The message was simple but unexpected. "I'm thinking of you. How's your mom? Is there anything I can do?" For a moment, Sarah just stared at the screen. She hadn't reached out to anyone beyond family. Too tired, too consumed by the grief to even consider it. But the message felt like a lifeline thrown into the dark waters she had been drowning in. She quickly typed a response, telling her friend how hard it was, how she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. Within an hour, Hannah was there. No questions asked, no waiting for an invitation. Just a warm hug, a cup of tea, and a steady presence by her side. They didn't talk about anything profound or life-changing. They simply sat in silence, and in that silence, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in days, the smallest glimmer of relief. It was a comfort that she couldn't explain but deeply needed, a reminder that she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. God, in that moment, had used her friend to bring a piece of light into the darkness. There were other small signs of kindness in the days that followed. A nurse who, noticing Sarah's exhaustion, made her a cup of coffee during a late-night shift. A text from an old church friend offering prayers for peace. A stranger at the cafe who paid for Sarah's coffee and wished her a quiet blessing. Each of these moments, while seemingly insignificant, began to add up, reminding Sarah that God's love wasn't always grandiose or miraculous. Sometimes, it came through the gentle kindness of a stranger, the silent offering of someone who knew the weight of her pain. These acts were like gentle whispers of God's presence, soft but undeniable. They were small, fleeting, but significant reminders that he hadn't forgotten her in her suffering. Each kindness, each simple gesture, was like a thread weaving her back to a place of hope. In the midst of the chaos that had become her life, Sarah began to notice moments of unexpected peace. It was never long, just brief pauses in the storm, but each one left an imprint on her heart. One such moment came early one morning as she stood outside the hospital. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm golden light across the sky. The air was crisp, and the world seemed to be holding its breath. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to absorb the stillness. There was something sacred in that moment, something that felt like a gift, a fleeting but undeniable sense of peace. As she breathed in the fresh air, Sarah allowed herself to let go of the whirlwind of thoughts and fears that had been consuming her. For a few seconds, the worry about her mother's condition, the doubts about her faith, and the overwhelming grief seemed to fade. The only thing that mattered in that moment was the quiet assurance that she was not alone. It wasn't a dramatic, earth-shattering moment. The pain hadn't disappeared. Her mother was still unwell, and the future remained uncertain, But in that moment, Sarah felt as if the world had slowed, and for the first time in days, her heart found a gentle rhythm. There were other moments like that. Once, when she was walking down a hospital hallway, she heard a child's laughter echo from a nearby room. The sound was so pure, so innocent, that it stopped her in her tracks. In that laughter, she heard a reminder of joy, a reminder that life continued even in the darkest seasons. For a brief second, the sorrow seemed to lift, and she felt a glimmer of hope. A reminder that even amidst suffering, joy could still exist. Another moment of peace came when Sarah sat in her mother's room late one night, the only sounds being the soft beeping of the monitors and her mother's shallow breaths. Sarah closed her eyes for a few moments, holding her mother's hand. In that stillness, a wave of calm washed over her. It wasn't the kind of peace she had expected, where everything would be resolved or fixed. No, this peace was different. It was the kind that settled deep in her soul, a quiet assurance that no matter how bad things got, God was with her in that room. And that was enough. Despite the overwhelming darkness that clouded her mind, Sarah could sense a shift in her heart. These small moments, these fleeting flashes of peace and kindness, began to soften the walls she had built around herself. She began to reflect on her past experiences with God and, in doing so, slowly found her faith reawakening. One afternoon, while sitting alone in the hospital chapel, Sarah thumbed through an old Bible that had been left on the pew. She had never been particularly fond of the Psalms, but today the words seemed to leap off the page. She came across Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Her heart caught in her chest as the words sank in. In that moment, she felt a profound understanding, a reminder that God had always been near to her, even when she couldn't sense him. She realized that God hadn't abandoned her in her grief, even if she couldn't always see his presence. Her heart had been so focused on the pain that it had blinded her to the quiet ways God was showing up, through the kindness of others, through those brief moments of peace, and through the memories of his faithfulness in her past. Later that evening, as she sat with her mother, Sarah's thoughts drifted to the times when she had experienced God's goodness in the past, when prayers had been answered, when God's provision had come through in unexpected ways, and when she had felt his presence in moments of joy. In that reflection, her spirit was renewed. God had been faithful before, and he would be faithful again. It wasn't a promise of immediate healing, or that her mother would be saved. But it was a reminder that God's love was not dependent on her circumstances. His presence was not limited to the times of joy and peace, but was even more real in the midst of suffering. In that moment, Sarah could hear the faint echo of God's voice. "I am with you always, even in this." The small signs of God's presence, those unexpected acts of kindness, the fleeting moments of peace, and the quiet awakenings of faith, had begun to open her heart again. She was learning to trust that God's goodness was not something that could be measured by her circumstances, but was something deeper, something eternal. And though she still had questions, she was beginning to understand that even in the darkest valleys, his love never failed. It was the middle of the night when Sarah experienced the turning point. The hospital room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines that monitored her mother's health. Sarah sat next to the bed, her hands resting on her mother's frail, motionless hand. She had grown accustomed to the silence, to the sense of waiting that lingered in the air. There was no real conversation anymore, just the steady passage of time and the constant hum of machines. That night, however, something in Sarah felt different. She was tired, more exhausted than she could remember, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. The weight of her mother's illness had pressed down on her for so long that she felt as though she might crack under the strain. Every prayer she whispered had felt like it was bouncing off an empty sky. Every verse she read felt distant, and every promise felt hollow. And yet in that moment, she heard a soft whisper in her soul. It was not an audible voice, but a deep, unmistakable sense of a presence. She felt it like a wave rolling over her, a peace that didn't make sense, a calm that shouldn't have been possible in the face of such pain. It wasn't an answer to her prayers. It wasn't the miraculous healing she had hoped for. But it was something even more powerful, a sense of assurance that she was not alone. Tears began to fall as Sarah bowed her head. She didn't know where the words came from, but they spilled out of her heart. God, I don't understand this. I don't understand why this is happening. I don't know how much longer I can keep going. But I trust you. I trust that you are here. I trust that you are good. As she prayed, something shifted within her. She wasn't praying for an answer anymore. She wasn't asking for a miracle or trying to understand the reasons for her mother's suffering. Instead, she was simply acknowledging God's presence. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a connection to something greater than her pain. It wasn't a sudden dramatic epiphany, but a quiet revelation. God's goodness was not about her circumstances. His goodness was not tied to what he gave or didn't give, to what he healed or left broken. It was a presence, a love that didn't waver, no matter how dark the situation seemed. She realized that, even in the silence, he had never left her. Even in her deepest grief, he had been near, comforting her in ways she had never fully recognized. She sat there, feeling the weight of that realization settle over her. The peace that had flooded her soul didn't take away the pain, but it gave her the strength to keep going. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how long her mother had left, but she knew that God was still good, and somehow, that was enough. The next day, as Sarah walked down the long, sterile hospital corridors, the weight of the revelation began to fully sink in. There was a mystery to suffering, a complexity that couldn't be neatly explained or understood. It wasn't something she could fix with a simple prayer or a few verses of scripture. There were no easy answers, no pat solutions to the problem of pain. But there was something else, something deeper, she had learned in her quiet prayer the night before. She had always believed that God's goodness meant that he would heal, restore, and make things right. But now, Sarah began to understand that God's goodness wasn't just about intervention or fixing what was broken. It was about his presence in the midst of the brokenness. It was about his character, his love, and his faithfulness, which were not contingent upon the absence of pain. In the weeks that had passed, Sarah had searched for an explanation, some reason for her mother's suffering. She had hoped that if she understood why, she could make sense of the pain. But she realized that she might never have those answers. Suffering, she understood now, was a mystery. It wasn't something she could simply untangle. And yet, that didn't mean it was pointless. It didn't mean that God was absent, or that he didn't care. As she reflected on the pain of her own journey, Sarah thought back to the stories of the saints, the martyrs, the people who had endured incredible suffering, but had somehow found God in the midst of it. She thought of Job, who had lost everything, yet in his sorrow had said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." She thought of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, praying in agony, asking God to take the cup of suffering from him, yet still surrendering to the will of the Father. Suffering, Sarah realized, was not something to be avoided or eliminated. It was part of the human experience, a part of life that no one could escape. And while she couldn't explain it, she could embrace it, knowing that God was with her in it. He wasn't distant or indifferent to her pain. In fact, he was closer than ever, walking with her through the hardest moments of her life. She remembered a conversation she'd had with her mother before the illness had taken hold. Her mother had told her, "Sarah, God doesn't always take away the pain, but he always gives us the strength to endure it. And his love is always there, even when it feels like everything else is falling apart." At the time, Sarah hadn't fully understood those words, but now she did. The mystery of suffering didn't have to make sense in order to trust in God's goodness. His love was steadfast, even when everything else was uncertain. And in that love, Sarah found the strength to face the days ahead. In the days that followed, Sarah's perspective shifted. Her mother's health continued to decline, and though there were still moments of overwhelming sadness, there was a sense of peace that had settled deep within her heart. It was a peace that transcended her understanding, a peace that didn't rely on her circumstances. It was the kind of peace that could only come from knowing that God's presence was with her, even in the darkest times. Sarah began to speak more openly about her faith with those around her. She shared her struggles with friends, telling them how, in her pain, she had come to understand that God's goodness wasn't about fixing everything, but about being with her through it all. She shared how she had found comfort in the quiet, subtle ways God had shown up. Through the kindness of friends, the beauty of a sunset, the peace in the silence. She didn't have all the answers, but she had hope, and that hope was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to recognize that her faith had been renewed. It wasn't the kind of faith that expected answers or immediate relief. It was the kind of faith that trusted God, even in the mystery of suffering. It was the kind of faith that knew that God's goodness was not contingent on her circumstances, but on His unchanging character. Though she didn't know what the future held, she knew one thing for certain. God was with her. He had always been with her, and that was enough to carry her through the hardest days of her life. Sarah had always been a somewhat private person, especially when it came to her struggles. She had always prided herself on being strong and independent, believing that to truly handle pain, one had to bear it alone. But as her mother's illness stretched on, she found that the weight of isolation was becoming unbearable. The constant demands of caregiving, the emotional strain, and the uncertainty about the future left her feeling drained and disconnected. It wasn't long before she realized that she couldn't do it all on her own. It was during one of her visits to church that the first crack in her resolve began to appear. Sarah had been attending services intermittently, but it was difficult to engage fully when her mind was constantly elsewhere. One Sunday after the service, she found herself standing near the back of the church, trying to make her way out quickly. But before she could slip away, someone called her name. It was Emily, a woman from her Bible study group. "Hey, Sarah! We've been praying for you and your mom. How's everything going?" Emily asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Sarah paused, hesitating. She had always kept her emotions tightly guarded, but something in Emily's kind eyes made her falter. Without thinking, the floodgates opened. It's been so hard," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I'm so tired, and I don't know how to keep doing this." Emily's face softened, and she placed a hand gently on Sarah's arm. "You don't have to do this alone, Sarah. We're here for you. You have a whole church family that loves you, and we want to help carry this burden with you." Sarah hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words. She had become so absorbed in her own pain that she had forgotten that others, people who had walked similar roads, might be right there with her, ready to offer support. That conversation was the beginning of a shift. It was an invitation into fellowship, into the kind of community that didn't shy away from suffering but embraced it, offering comfort and strength in shared experiences. In the following weeks, Sarah allowed herself to open up more. She attended the Bible study group regularly, and on days when she felt particularly overwhelmed, she reached out to others in the congregation. Her friends and fellow believers rallied around her, offering everything from meals to prayers, from visits to simple words of encouragement. It became clear to Sarah that there was a deep well of love and support in the community that she had been neglecting to tap into. As the days passed, Sarah began to see the truth in Emily's words. She didn't have to carry this burden alone. Through the simple acts of kindness from her church family, Whether it was someone bringing over a home-cooked meal, sending an encouraging text, or just offering a listening ear, Sarah started to experience a new kind of strength. It wasn't her strength, but a collective strength that flowed through the people who surrounded her. It was God's love made tangible in the hands and hearts of those who cared for her. In moments of quiet, Sarah reflected on how God's goodness had often been evident through the care of others. She had heard the phrase, "the body of Christ," many times before, but now she was beginning to understand it in a new way. The church was not just a place for worship on Sundays, nor was it a social club. It was a family bound together by love, united in shared suffering and joy. And in that family, Sarah found a sense of belonging that had been missing for so long. One evening, after a particularly tough day at the hospital, Sarah came home to find a card in her mailbox from a member of the congregation. Inside, there was a simple note. "We are praying for you. May God give you strength and peace today." It wasn't much, but it was everything. It was a reminder that God's goodness was not only something she could experience in quiet moments of prayer or reflection, but was also present in the loving actions of the people around her. Their prayers, their compassion, became a form of collective healing that helped sustain her faith through the most difficult moments. In a world that often encourages self-reliance and individualism, Sarah began to see that true healing and strength often come when we allow others to walk with us through our suffering. God's love wasn't just something she had to seek on her own. It was woven into the relationships, the shared burdens, and the care of others. It was through the community that Sarah found the courage to keep going, not because her circumstances had changed, but because she no longer had to carry them alone. As Sarah leaned into the support of her church family, her faith grew stronger. The love of others reminded her of God's unshakable love for her. She came to realize that, though suffering was a part of life, the community, the body of Christ, was a powerful means by which God shared His goodness with His people. It was in this fellowship, in this collective experience of shared faith, that Sarah found the strength to endure and the hope to keep moving forward. As Sarah sat on the hospital bench that morning, her gaze fell upon the flickering candle in the chapel, the soft light, casting long shadows on the walls. Her mother, still in a fragile state, rested in her hospital room a few floors above, but something had changed within Sarah. The heavy weight of her grief had not disappeared, but it had shifted. For the first time in weeks, she felt a quiet assurance, something deeper than the restless ache that had plagued her heart for so long. She thought back to the early days of her mother's illness when the world had felt so small and dark. Every day had been marked by an unrelenting sense of loss, a deep and gnawing pain that seemed to stretch into eternity. She had fought so hard to understand it, to make sense of the suffering, to pray for healing and to ask why. It had felt like a battle against an invisible force, one that she couldn't control and couldn't escape. But now, sitting in that chapel, Sarah saw her suffering in a new light. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't understand why her mother's illness had dragged on for so long or why they had to endure such hardship. But she had come to see that suffering, in and of itself, was not meaningless. It was an opportunity, an invitation to grow, to deepen her relationship with God, and to experience His presence in ways she had never imagined. It was no longer just about the pain. It was about what God could do through it, how He could use it to soften her heart, to help her release her need for control, and to draw her closer to Him. She had learned that in the most broken places of her life, God's love and goodness were often most evident. She had seen it in the unexpected kindness of others, in the fleeting moments of peace amidst the turmoil, and in the steady, unshakable presence of God that had not left her side. In this new perspective, suffering was no longer an enemy to be defeated. It was a pathway to something deeper, something more intimate with God. It was in the trials, the uncertainty, and the waiting that Sarah had learned to lean into God's presence like never before. The hurt wasn't gone, but it was no longer the defining factor of her life. She had come to realize that in the midst of her suffering, she could find meaning, growth, and a closeness to God that might not have been possible otherwise. The hospital room felt different now. It was the same sterile walls, the same monotonous beeping of machines. But Sarah no longer felt like she was trapped in a place of hopelessness. She had been here so many times before, waiting, hoping, fearing. And yet, as she sat by her mother's bedside, there was a quiet peace in her heart. She had learned to trust God, not just with her mother's health, but with her own heart. And she could feel His presence in the room with them. There was still a long road ahead. The future remained uncertain. Her mother's condition had not changed overnight, and there were still days filled with doubt and sorrow. But Sarah had come to understand that God's goodness was not contingent on immediate resolution. It wasn't about her circumstances changing or her prayers being answered in the way she had hoped. It was about something deeper, about learning to trust in God's love and faithfulness no matter what. She remembered the moments of kindness, the small signs that had reminded her that she was not alone, the prayer of a friend when she didn't have the words to pray herself, the unexpected texts and visits from church members, the quiet moments when, despite the chaos of her life, she had felt the peace of God wash over her. She could see now how these were not random events, but the threads of God's goodness, woven into her life in ways she had never fully appreciated before. Each one was a small but significant reminder that He had been with her all along. Sarah's faith had been transformed. It wasn't a faith based on her circumstances or on what she could see with her eyes, but on a deep, unshakable trust in who God was. It was a faith that knew suffering was not the end of the story. It was a faith that had been tested, refined, and strengthened in the fire. And though she didn't have all the answers, she had something far more precious, a heart that had learned to rest in the goodness of God, even in the hardest of times. As Sarah left the hospital later that evening, the sky was painted with the colors of a setting sun, streaks of orange and pink spreading across the horizon. It felt like a moment of quiet beauty, a rare gift amidst the noise of her daily life. She stood still for a moment, breathing in the cool evening air, allowing herself to simply be present. The road ahead remained uncertain. There were still so many questions, so much pain. But in that moment, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that suffering would continue to be a part of her journey. There would be more days of pain, more moments of doubt, more nights when her heart felt heavy with grief. But now she also knew that suffering was not the end. There was something more, a future joy that lay beyond the pain. Her thoughts turned to the hope of heaven, to the promise of ultimate restoration. She thought of the verse she had clung to during her darkest moments. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. Revelation 21:4. In that moment, she felt the truth of those words sink deep into her heart. The suffering she faced now, the brokenness of this world, was not the final chapter. There was an eternal hope that one day, God would make all things new. Her mother's pain, her own, and the pain of all who suffer would one day be no more. The grief, the struggle, the heartache, all of it would be swallowed up in the joy of God's perfect kingdom. And though she couldn't fully comprehend what that restoration would look like, Sarah knew that it was real. It was a promise that one day all things would be made right. There would be no more sorrow, no more separation, no more suffering. And in that future hope, she found the strength to keep going, knowing that no matter what came next, God's goodness would carry her through, today, tomorrow, and into eternity. As Sarah walked into the night, a sense of quiet joy filled her heart. Though she wasn't free from suffering, she had found something greater than freedom from pain, the assurance that God's goodness would never leave her, and that no matter the trials of this life, there was a future joy beyond all imagining waiting for her. In the vibrant and supportive community dedicated to Jesus, Super Chat offers a unique and impactful way for viewers to actively participate in the mission of spreading faith and supporting charitable causes. When you engage in a live stream and use Super Chat, you are not just making a financial contribution, but also amplifying your voice within the community. This feature allows you to send a highlighted message along with your donation, which is prominently displayed during the live broadcast. It's a powerful way to show your support, share words of encouragement, or ask for prayers. Every Super Chat helps fund the community's various initiatives, from outreach programs to maintaining the digital presence that allows the message of Jesus to reach a wider audience. By participating in Super Chat, you're playing a crucial role in helping the community thrive, ensuring that it can continue to inspire, educate, and uplift others. Your contributions are more than just donations. They are a testament to your commitment to the values of love, generosity, and faith that define our shared journey. In the heart of our Jesus-centered community, Super Chat serves as a powerful tool for deepening engagement and enhancing our collective mission. This feature, available on live streaming platforms like YouTube, allows you to contribute financially during live broadcasts while simultaneously sharing a personalized message with the entire community. As you participate in Super Chat, your message and donation are highlighted, offering a unique opportunity to publicly express your support, share your personal testimony, or even request prayer for yourself or others. This visibility not only showcases your commitment, but also fosters a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose among all viewers. The contributions you make through Super Chat play a pivotal role in sustaining and expanding the community's efforts. Whether it's supporting outreach initiatives, funding community events, or maintaining the digital infrastructure necessary for live streams and online ministry, your donations help ensure that the message of Jesus reaches as many hearts as possible. By using Super Chat, you help to amplify the impact of our shared mission, making it possible for us to continue providing valuable resources, support, and inspiration to both existing members and newcomers alike. Moreover, Super Chat offers a way for you to be more involved in the life of the community. Your highlighted messages can encourage dialogue, spark discussions, and build connections with others who share your faith and values. It's not just about giving financially, it's about becoming an active participant in the growth and vibrancy of our community. Each Super Chat contribution helps to create a dynamic and interactive environment where ideas and support flow freely, making the community stronger and more unified. To make the most of Super Chat, it's important to understand how your contributions are utilized and to ensure transparency in the community's financial practices. Knowing that your support is used effectively to further the mission can enhance your sense of involvement and trust in the community. Additionally, publicly acknowledging and thanking donors during live streams not only shows appreciation, but also encourages others to join in, creating a ripple effect of generosity and engagement. In essence, Super Chat is more than just a financial tool. It's a means of connecting deeply with our community, supporting our shared goals, and actively participating in the mission of spreading Jesus' teachings. By contributing through Super Chat, you are helping to build a vibrant, supportive, and faith-driven community that thrives on mutual encouragement and collective action. Your involvement makes a significant difference, and together, we can continue to grow and impact lives in meaningful ways.